Welcome to the Dueling Banjos podcast. Today we're going to be talking about the 2007 sci-fi drama film Sunshine, directed by Danny Boyle, starring Cillian Murphy, Chris Evans, and a smattering of others. We're going to be looking a little bit at what we thought of the movie, interpretations, because it is a very complex movie. I'll start with my take. I found the film to be actually quite spiritual, as much as it is science-based and about, of course, them dropping a bomb on sun to reignite it. There is a spiritual element to me, and all of the characters seem to exist on a spectrum, in my opinion, on science to faith. And you see characters that are outright more spiritual or have some sort of belief in the sun as being a transcendental power, and you have others that are more scientific. The ones who are more scientific tend to be the ones that are like the mission, we got to complete the mission at all costs. They're focused on of course, the science of things. And so you have the primary faith-based characters, and don't necessarily like that characterization, but the more spiritual ones being Searle, who's the psychiatrist, Kappa, who's the physicist, and Kaneda, who's the captain. What I found really interesting is that all of those characters who seem to have some sort of belief in the sun as being a greater transcendental power die by the sun, and in doing so die in the light, as it were. And then, of course, there's Pinbacker, but he's sort of more on the extremist end. And then all the other characters seem to die in almost a cold darkness. So Mace quite literally freezes to death, as does Harvey. But a lot of those other characters, and all of them, seem to die isolated in the dark. Trey, of course, kills himself. And there just seems to me to be a very strong contrast between the characters that sort of had this fascination with the sun, deeper fascination with the sun, and the characters that were just all about science, getting the mission done. And also, the final thing I'll add on that is the treatment of the deaths. So Kappa, Searle, and Kaneda, their deaths are all treated as something, I don't know, there's a greater contentedness, I think, in the characters in their death. Searle always was the most fascinated character with the sun. The film starts out with him wanting to turn the brightness up, right, of the sun, viewership of the sun. And he dies in a contented, sitting there staring at the sun by kind of his own fruition, kind of not. He's abandoned on that ship. And Kaneda is out there, and you see he sort of, you do hear him scream, but I think that's just a byproduct of the fact that he's dying in somewhat of a gruesome way, burning. But you see just in the presentation that it's not lingering on the pain necessarily the way it is with other characters. He is recognizing sort of this greater transcendental experience of dying this way. And it's very different than, say, Mace's death, where you see his legs pinned against the thing, and he's bleeding out there. He's freezing very slowly. Corazon bleeds out after getting stabbed by Pinbacker. And that's a relatively slow process. Trey, his death is off screen, but you see the deterioration of his psychology is a process that lingers on sort of a existential pain. Then, of course, Harvey slowly freezes as he drifts off into space. And perhaps a slightly comedic moment, but one that reinforces what I'm saying, is when Harvey hits something out in space and his arm comes detached and floats off. And so it just seemed like the film itself was treating these characters who didn't really have that sort of transcendental fascination with the sun in a more painful, cold, isolated way, as opposed to the ones who did die in the sun. There is a greater contentedness, and I think that reflects a certain degree of spirituality that the film's presenting.
Yeah, I think it's not a spiritual movie. Or if it is, the spirituality is secular or worldly. And I almost go as far as to say the sun is the villain. So you can have in nature, objects that are too bright to see, or experiences of the senses that are impossible or extreme. And so the idea of looking into the sun has fascination as a extreme form of sight or some, basing of the senses or some experience of the senses that is not possible in real life. You use the term transcendental, and transcendental to me refers to something higher. So the conception of experience is that the senses are incapable of taking in, like looking at the sun that close, you die. That is spiritual only in an extreme secular sense or worldly sense. It's not transcendental in what we would associate with a religious sense. And so the sun has a fascination, but it basically is, the destructive power of nature at work. And the whole movie is very technologically optimistic in contrast to a lot of sci-fi movies that are not, where the powers of human ingenuity in creating technology can overcome the boundaries of nature, which is very often a destructive force. So you mentioned someone like Searle, who certainly has a fascination with the sun, and he dies, a good Roman suicide. But to me, it's not so much that he's come to some higher spiritual understanding as much as he's accepted the boundaries of what a human can experience of nature. It's spiritual only in the sense that it's comprehending man's literal limits in the face of nature. And so the transcendental aspect of things, which I would want to associate with religious belief or the idea of other worlds beyond, is not very relevant to this movie. And where it is somewhat relevant is in what Pinbacker says. And we get a very negative portrayal of religion in that instance, where he's the one who says that man has no right, it's not man's place to violate nature and natural bounds. So if the sun is dying, humans have no right to stop it from dying or to stop themselves from dying off because of that. So he's the only one who mentions God, and his mentioning of God is saying God is the orderer of nature. God is controlling nature. There is some higher will that can be seen in a destructive natural process. And the human does not really have a right to violate that in the broadest sense. Now, of course, we try to improve life with technology, and we do improve life with technology. But with something like the sun dying out, that's so cosmic of an event that it becomes given, a higher meaning, and there's a higher will that's insisting that be done. And so the human has no right to violate that. And so, using the term spiritual is difficult because to me, spiritual always refers to a religious conception. I don't know if you agree on that.
Well, I think that actually the basis for how much effort they put in is founded on a belief that a higher meaning exists.
But what's your evidence?
Because they could presumably just let the sun die. They could just let humanity not exist. They don't, presumably because they think there's some reward out of keeping humanity alive. But that's the macro scale, right?
The reward is obvious. Humanity wants to persist.
No, because you could believe in Pinbacker's thought process, which is if nature is exterminating humanity, then it's meant to be.
Right.
Right. So presumably, if you don't think that way, you think humanity is worth preserving, but you have to have a motivation for believing humanity is worth preserving and putting in the fight. And so I think if you lay the foundation, so let's just set the stage and assume that God exists, that a higher power exists. Then you basically are suggesting that or conceding certain things about the existence of humans as being a product of God's creation. And God deliberately gave humans free will, which means that he did create the world in such a way to where his creation in humans are tasked with being self-preserving. And so where Pinbacker goes too far in his extremism is suggesting that God's will is to let humanity die. I don't think that's true. I think God's will is to encourage humanity to preserve itself. And ultimately, the decision not to give up, but fight so hard in the end to accomplish the mission, even though it means sacrificing themselves, is a result of a faith that creation is worth preserving, that there is a higher meaning towards humans preserving themselves because there's some reward out of life. If you don't believe there's any reward out of life, which reward is often dictated by a belief in something greater, then who cares? Like, to me, the atheist belief would be to say, yeah, the world's dying, we can't do anything about it, just see it to its end.
I don't think that's the atheist belief. The atheist believes that all of human life is what we have in worldly existence, or if we can get to space existence. But the point is that that's all of life. So your reading of human technological capacity as being an outgrowth of nature, anticipated by God to some degree. In other words, the creation of the giant spaceship is nature because man is nature. Man is an animal who has technological capacities. So that then becomes an aspect of nature because man can create it, right? That's your point. But the technological capacity is used to preserve worldly life. It's not used to give you a higher spiritual understanding of after death. It's used to keep you alive on Earth, right? Or, keep you alive in general terms. So to view technology as being some spiritual, preserver of life, it's not spiritual. It's more practical. We got to live. Our point is to live. Our point is not to consider what happens after death. It's to consider how we can keep ourselves alive as long as possible for what we know. And so, how do you deal with the fact that the only character who mentions God is Pinbacker? Not a single one of the crew members indicates any real belief in a religious sense. And you're staking it, I think, on the experiences of, those who die in the light as being kind of a transcendental experience. But where's the indication that there's a world elsewhere?
Well, there isn't necessarily. I don't think it's selecting a specific religious practice to say, or to suggest that as the most virtuous belief system. It's just a generalized, like sort of an agnosticism in a way. So Danny Boyle, the director, actually said himself, he classifies himself as a sort of scientific agnostic. Or actually, that's no. I thought that was a spiritual atheist, is what he said. Now, I don't know what necessarily that means, but it seems to me to be him suggesting that transcendent experiences can occur, presumably as a result of something greater, but his personal belief that is God, as we know it through the lens of Christianity or Islam or whatever, he doesn't necessarily buy that specifically. But he does buy the idea that there is some sort of higher power, transcendental experiences that people can have. And so that's reflected in the most virtuous character, which is Kappa, who arguably the most virtuous character in Kappa, who at the end does everything to make sure the science works to complete the mission, but is seen in his death in the light, experiencing. I mean, he's almost smiling at the end. You have to ask, so why is he smiling? Well, maybe he's smiling because the mission is being completed. I think he's smiling because this moment of falling into the light is a transcendental experience, which does exactly counter the dreams he had of falling into the sun as being a very painful, tormented experience.
Yeah, but it's because of the higher meaning given to sacrifice, not the higher meaning given to some comprehension of a transcendent world. I mean, you keep using the term spiritual and transcendental, but you have to define them. So if any heightened experience in the world, say an aesthetic experience or the comprehension of some awesome thing in nature, like the sun, if that's your definition, I mean, it's just a heightened human experience. So if that's your definition of what's spiritual, then anything that's sufficiently intense in life is a spiritual experience, right? I mean, well, but it's not really spiritual in the truest sense of being a comprehension of another.
I mean, that's why
other life.
Well, that's why some people consider like the taking of hallucinogenic drugs to be transcendentals. Presumably, you're having an out-of-body experience, and it's not a specific religious one necessarily. I mean, I don't know. I haven't done it. Maybe it is religious. I don't know. But the people who have done it have said, you know, it's an out-of-body experience that is sort of like this euphoric, transcendental encounter experience.
I would like to hear your definition of transcendental. Is it what I just said?
No.
Is it anything sufficiently intense that in human experience, is that a transcendental experience?
No, because something can be intense and not be necessarily transcendental. I think transcendental is a experience of powerlessness in the face of something greater. I don't know what that something is, but if you think about like Joan of Arc, presumably having visions of Virgin Mary, so there you have somebody who's a very powerful figure who, in this moment of powerlessness, is recognizing something religious.
Religious, yeah.
But you've seen Joan of Arc. I mean, that specific example was religious.
But Joan of Arc goes to the stake completely confident that she's plucked from the world and she's up in a true transcendent world.
As a result of that experience.
Okay, so that is transcendence. It's there is a world after death that is not available to our senses while we have them while we're alive. Now that's different than saying
you're trying to make it specific to a religion, and I'm saying
I'm not making it specific to a religion. You could all kinds of religions say there's a form of existence after death. It's not specific to a religion. You're saying that you can call something spiritual and transcendent that's in the boundary of human sensory experience, namely living human experience. So something's transcendental if it's just the overwhelming power of nature and something that's essentially impossible to see, like the sun that close.
Okay, but then to circle back to the film, as Searle said, is asking Kaneda when he's out there looking at the sun, what do you see?
Because it's an extraordinary thing. It's not humans.
But
humans have
you know that the natural experience of seeing the sun is just going blind.
and die.
So, right. So what is he asking? What is he asking Kaneda to say? I see a blinding light. Now I can't see anymore. Everything's dark. That doesn't see. I mean, as a guy who's on a ship with a bunch of scientists, you would think he'd understand that if you look into the sun, you're blinded. So he's asking for something more there in that instance.
Yeah, well, it's an overwhelming experience in life. None of the crew members suggest that Kaneda looking into the sun and having some sort of rapturous experience by dying in the sun leads to any persistence for Kaneda. He's dead. No one suggests that he's gone somewhere. Do they?
Well, no, because that's not the immediate problem that they're dealing with. They just lost their captain.
Well, right. They're concerned with practical questions of preserving life, because in life, there are heightened experiences that make life worth living. And if you're going to die, you might as well die in the throes of a heightened experience, like looking into the sun, which is a magnificent thing for a human to do.
Because I think the words are deliberately chosen. He didn't ask, what do you feel? What are you experiencing? He said, what do you see? Now, that's the one question in the face of the sun that a scientist would not ask, because they know if you look into the sun that you see nothing, you're immediately blinded.
Well, in the very brief moment you have to look at it before you die, you've obviously seen something that's extraordinary from a human perspective. That's what he's asking.
But there is a blinding light? I mean, I can go stare into the sun from here and it hurts my eyes. I'm not seeing anything greater. I'm not like, oh, the sun.
It's a reverence for the awesome powers of nature, ultimately.
Through the experience, which is not what Searle is asking. He's asking specifically, what do you see? Not what are you experiencing? What do you feel? What do you see? Well, if I look at the sun, I know I'm going to see the sun and it's going to hurt my eyes. Even just from here on Earth. Now, you may say being up that close somehow makes it greater, but to me, the more awe-inspiring sight is of the sun with the shield in front of it, where you can actually see something that close.
Yeah, but it's like you have this idea that humans don't risk death for the heights of sensory experience. Why does anyone climb Mount Everest? Why does anyone do something extreme? It's to have a heightened experience in the sensory aspect that you can call spiritual of a kind, but it's not spiritual in the literal sense of persistence or I continue into another world, inaccessible to the living experience of the senses.
Well, arguing as a false equivalency, because Mount Everest, presumably you could survive, and the sense of accomplishment of reaching the top or whatever is almost provides the experience. Obviously, I'm sure the view is awe-inspiring as well, but the accomplishment, the achievement of having climbed it is ultimately the reward, right?
Yeah.
And so that's different than looking at the sun super close, where you're not going to survive. There is no sense of accomplishment for Kaneda or Searle.
Sure there is.
No, there isn't.
There's
no guarantee that they're going to complete the mission. Searle doesn't know that the mission will be completed when it dies.
I get that, but there's a satisfaction in having sacrificed yourself for the good of mankind that is a just reward for dying. There's no necessity to say that this experience is truly transcendental in the sense that I persist after it. And no one suggests that. It's a secular spirituality.
You're equating transcendental with the afterlife.
I am, yeah.
Yeah. I don't think that's necessarily the case. I think you can have transcendental experiences while you're alive.
Okay, but in what sense is it transcendental beyond a extreme form of human sensory experience? You look at something that humans aren't meant to see, like the sun, and you die. And the experience is made meaningful by the fact that you've seen something, even for just a brief second, or a light. Sure, that no human has seen. It's a phenomenal experience, but it ends your experience. So to call it transcendental, you can only call it transcendental in the terms of natural religion. It's a secular transcendence of something that that human senses were not meant to see. And it's highly meaningful because it's so extreme, but it doesn't give promises of a true transcendental persistence. The only guy who talks in religious language is Pinbacker, right?
Well, the only guy who mentions God is Pinbacker.
That's significant.
Well, it's significant in going back to my original idea of the spectrum of which these characters exist on. He is an extremist end of the faith spectrum to the toxic extremism of belief over science.
Okay, but
whereas Kappa, even Searle to a degree, and Kaneda see a relationship or a coexistence between the two. Pinbacker does not. And I think somebody like Mace does not. Mace is like, the science, the engineering is what's going to solve this. We need to make sure everything's working. And Pinbacker's like, trust God, absolutely, that this is his will. We're not meant to interfere. Those are the two extreme ends of the spectrum. And you see all the other characters somewhere in the middle.
Okay, but it doesn't take away from the fact that, I mean, I said that the sun is the villain of the movie. Who's the character most associated with the sun is Pinbacker.
No, I don't think the sun is the villain of the movie.
Well, it's shown to be a natural force that humans require for life, but it's also, shown. I mean, it's a dying star. It's shown to be, and it kills people. Obviously, it's a destructive force. And insofar as you find some sort of resonance or higher meaning in dying in the light, it destroys your life. You're gone. So we're combating this natural force that is powerful enough to kill us. And if it dies, it kills everyone. And in Pinbacker, you have the idea that the sun, if it's come to die, I mean, he gives it, he just says God wants this. But if the sun is coming to the point where it's dying, that's almost its own will. That's the will of nature, so to speak, that this happened. And so humans combating that puts humans against nature. I get your point that humans are a part of nature and any technology they produce is ultimately natural as well. But it's still, this is the natural cycle of things. This is the natural cycle of stars. It's embodying a certain will, a certain natural bent of things in nature. And so for humans to violate that, you're setting yourself up against nature. And so the sun is, it kills people. It's a menacing presence.
No, to call something a villain, I think, implies intent. I think that because arguably the total opposite is true too, that the sun is the hero by that metric, because the sun ultimately is what is determining whether life persists or not. Its existence,
well, you're saying it's determining. That's showing intention.
No,
you're using the language of intention also.
Because it just exists. It's the intention of the characters to reignite it. It's the intent, or the intent of Pinbacker to stop people from reigniting it. The sun itself, I don't think, has an intent. That'd be to suggest that it has a consciousness, which would actually be playing more into my sort of transcendent. It means more, is with greater power.
Right. The crew doesn't believe the sun or some higher power controlling the sun, like God, has intent. The sun is just a physical object. It's an immense physical object that is, pushes the limits of human sensory experience, but it's ultimately a mechanical thing. And we can use our own mechanical understanding to regenerate it. There's no sense that there's some, higher intention or will at work any more than this is a physical process that has threatened the entire human species, and we have to reverse it by technological means.
Okay, but I guess that my question to you then would be, why are people inclined to exist and to continue to work, even in the most extreme situations, to preserve life? There has to be a motivation for it.
The motivation might be entirely secular. This is all there is. So
I don't necessarily buy that.
Okay, but what gives you the impression that the crew is anything but secular?
Because of, one, the presentations of the deaths and the deliberate showing of certain characters as having this awe and in sort of deeper belief in what they're doing as being greater than just a mission, a scientific mission.
Well, it's a scientific mission that saves everyone. So you say, well, all the characters get the death they deserve, and maybe everyone gets the death they deserve ultimately. The dignified, reaction to imminent death, you're saying is must be a spiritual experience, whether they think there's something going to happen to them after death or not. That's basically what you're saying. And I don't see why that can't be just a meaning invested in one's sacrifice to save life, worldly life. It doesn't have to be religious.
Well, that suggests then that worldly pleasures are a satisfactory enough reason to preserve life and go to their extremes. No, I don't think so.
They become more important to preserve it. There's no life.
A belief that
after death,
life has some sort of meaning is ultimately what contributes to human will.
Yeah, but the meaning, the distinction you have to draw is whether the meaning of life ultimately relates more to the life after death or whether the meaning of life relates to the life of the world. And so you can invest great meaning in worldly life, maybe even more meaning if you don't think there's anything else. Right? It becomes all the more important to preserve it. It becomes all the more important to savor things that are positive in life. And you say worldly pleasures like it's always referring to something, degenerate or something. It's not. It's if you have Kappa talks to his family and his family shown at the end of the movie. If you just say, well, I revere, the love of a family in the context of our worldly lives, that has great meaning.
Okay.
Totally independent of any suggestion that life goes on after you die.
Don't you believe that love in and of itself isn't a non-scientific idea?
No, it can be scientific.
How? There's no science behind love. There's, at least insofar as people...
There's science behind every human emotion.
No, there isn't.
Sure there is.
No, there isn't. Because love seems to me to be suggesting something deeper than just a care, right? If you care for people, maybe that means you love them in like a sort of very surface level sense, but it would seem to me that love, in terms of an experience, a strong experience towards another, is one that's impossible to really define or explain. And the idea of science is that you can identify and explain that.
Let's assume for a second that Pinbacker's right. Yeah. This is God's apocalypse, right? God is saying my will is that the human race has to expire on this basis, right?
Yeah.
Because there's there's a transcendent world where God rules, and this is the end of human worldly life. Let's assume that he's correct in the context of the movie, right?
Mm.
Is he not the one who's stating the ethical thing then? Because the point is that the only thing the mission does is it preserves human lives in the world.
Oh no, I've already contested that idea. Where he's saying it's not humans' role to play God. And I'm saying that in God giving human free will, it is in a sense their role to play God in terms of self-preservation. If God wanted to be the dictator of whether life persists or not, he could at the snap of a finger, presumably. He makes it possible for humans to preserve their life intentionally.
Well, you can't have it both ways. So you can't look at Kaneda and Searle and say they have some heroic sacrifice that they've come to some spiritual understanding and they die, out of some spiritual understanding or sacrifice for humans, and then say, but the primary purpose is to preserve human life. Either self-sacrificing has a greater meaning in my transcendent way of it's the opening to a different world, a truly transcendent world, or the only priority is to save worldly life. And so the crew on the mission are willing to sacrifice themselves for the preservation of the worldly life of everyone else. That's spiritual in some sense, if you want to use that word, but it's not spiritual in the highest sense of we have a confidence that this worldly life is not everything. So the religious elements that Pinbacker introduced pit nature against man, against man's technology. Nature is acting out the will of God. And I don't know how far he'd take it. I don't know if he'd say you can't have cars or something like that. But he certainly says in the highest sense of the sun is dying and human life will die. That is nature. That is God's will. That can't be interfered with. And insofar as humans do that, they are acting in their interests of worldly preservation against the idea that there's a transcendent world outside of worldly existence. So the spiritual reading of the movie ultimately depends on you putting primary value on the maintenance of human life in the world, not primary value on, man's soul, man's ethical imperatives, man's relationship in the afterlife with a God. We must preserve human worldly life. That's the primary goal of the mission. And insofar as that's spiritual, it's very secular.
Well, I think, again, the point that I've brought up is it's in the film's presentation. So you're looking for characters to come out and actively say, yeah, there's got to be something deeper religious to this, or like, it's almost like you want a scene where Kappa's praying or something like that. It's in the film's presentation of the experiences of dying by the sun, and showing that as something that the characters can be contented with, which is different than how the other people die. And in the treatment of the event, and I mean, remember that scene with Mace and Searle, where Searle comes in and starts talking about basically the transcendental power of the sun, but trying to some belief in a greater experience of observing the sun. And Mace is like, You're supposed to be the psychiatrist, yet you're crazier than me. That, to me, seems to be establishing a clear contrast between how Mace perceives the mission and what they're doing and the experience of it, and Searle, how Searle views it.
Well, Searle has a higher aesthetic imagination. That's all that's saying.
Right, which is inherently spiritual. Because he hasn't experienced the aesthetic, presumably, yet. So it's a belief that a greater aesthetics experience will occur. A belief in something you haven't experienced, but that is of something higher, is in and of itself a faith in something.
But a faith in what? A faith
doesn't matter. That's not what we're talking about. A specific religion. We're talking about
if your faith is man's ability to admire the extreme sensory experience of the world, and also to overcome destructive capacities of nature, that's not spiritual to me. That's just I wouldn't use that word. It's a putting a prime value on human worldly experience and what they can find meaning in the context of worldly life. And they can find meaning in the awesome powers of nature. They can find meaning in family. They can find meaning in whatever. But it's putting a primary value on that is what is meaningful for humans. Any suggestion that what's supremely meaningful for humans is some contact with God in the afterlife or after death is not the primary value. And so you can say, a lot of science fiction movies portray technology negatively. They say humans do not have the capacity to, fully deal with the dangerous powers of nature by technological ingenuity. And those movies, to me, would be far more spiritual or religious, because they'd be suggesting that whatever you think you can do practically in technological advances is not going to be sufficient to dealing with the ultimate questions of why you exist, and even perhaps the question of maintaining human life in the worldly sense. And so that then seems to suggest that you have to give some meaning to existence that is overtly religious in nature. But this movie shows the positives of human technology because the mission works. We can quibble with the scientific facts of the movie, but in the context of the movie, the technological ingenuity saves human worldly life. And that's the primary value that the crew members give to all existence, which is maintain the life of the world.
Well, the scientific technology doesn't individually save it. It is the motivation, the work, and the will of humans that allows the science to work.
Right, and that's in the interest of not dying, which is in the interest of not presuming that there's anything after death. Because if there's nothing after death, then you would put a supreme priority on keeping people alive in the only sense we know. So that's not a true transcendent belief in anything.
Well, I think that certain characters are presented as believing that they are doing something greater. You don't get any sense from Mace that he's reckoned with the idea necessarily that they're saving humanity.
Sure you do.
No, you don't.
Well, and he's done a lot. He's
not on an individually meaningful level.
He's the most practical guy of the crew,
right? But he's
the one who said, "Let's not take the Icarus to find the Icarus One," which was the source of all the problems ultimately that they had. He said, "We have a mission to save humanity. Let's stick to the mission." Now you're saying he lacks spiritual understanding on that basis.
Then combat Searle's argument, which is that their better chance of saving humanity is if they have two bombs.
Well, true, and the movie gives out that was not the correct choice to make.
Okay, but that, from a concept level, presumably more chances to save humanity is or is above, we're on a mission and our mission is just to drop this one bomb and come back. Right? They're making a human decision to increase their chances of completing the mission. Now, it doesn't work out that way, but the motivation behind making the decision, one was like, we're here just to do this one mission. We can't detour. I don't care if it gives us a second chance. We're here to do this, and if it doesn't work, it doesn't work. Whereas the other people were like, well, wait a second. We need this to work, and our best chance of making it work is if we get two shots at it.
Okay, but that's just a practical calculation, a practical disagreement between the characters. And, I can't totally accept your idea that Mace's death is spiritually deficient compared with Searle's death or Kaneda's death, because you're basically hitting at they die more in a more dignified way, in a more accepting way, whereas Mace dies in some struggle to, restore the mainframe, and he gets in the coolant, and it's the ugliness of his death, which is certainly heroic if it's not dignified. It's the ugliness that you have a problem with, but it's crucial. It's in the same sense that Kaneda says, I will die, I will burn in the sun to save the shield, and I may have some sort of resigned, heightened experience of dying in the sunlight in this way. You're putting a premium, almost a more value on that kind of death than I'll die, I'll go down struggling like Mace does, but I'm in the interest of saving the mission.
Well, they can't all go down struggling. They're all presented as sacrificing for the sake of the mission. Searle, he stays on that ship.
Right, but you're putting more value on those guys that die resignedly.
Because I think the film puts more value on it in its presentation. Those deaths are treated a lot more tastefully, might not be the right word, but they're not lingering on the pain of it.
But why? But then that's a different question of that you just happen to like the dignified way of dying, but the ugly heroic way of I'm gonna expire totally painfully while trying to save the mission. You're saying that's ugly in some sense, but it's not less heroic. It's not less valuable
because it comes down to the character's perspective as well. There really isn't that much resolve or contentedness in Mace's death.
There's certainly resolve.
Well, he's not.
His dying words are to tell Kappa to, you got to finish this. I've done what I can do, and I'm going to go down struggling doing what I can do, but you got to finish this. You got to finish this mission.
Yeah, but there's no peace in his death. He's trying to get out until the very end. He gets the last thing finished, and then his leg gets pinned, and he's fighting to get out until the very end. There is no peace. It's not like he's like, here is my fate, the way it was with Kaneda and Searle and even Kappa. It's like, maybe I could still get out, but he's struggling until the very end.
That's fine, and it's an uglier death. It's less dignified, but it's not less heroic.
I didn't say it was less heroic.
I said, again, what value are you putting on the people who die in the dignified, way of accept the burning of the sun?
I think the film is putting is establishing the idea that a certain deeper faith and a belief in science can coexist. Now, one is not necessarily more heroic than the other, but one is more transcendental and ultimately peaceful than the other.
Yeah, I don't get the sense. In other words, there's nothing Searle can do. We could run around Icarus 1 and see if he could, persist for a while, but he chooses to, I'm not going to prolong this. I'll sit in the observation room, which gives you the full power of the sun, and I'll die.
But no, there's endless ways you can kill yourself if that's what you wanted to do. His way was very deliberate.
It was.
I mean, he can kill himself by jumping out of the ship and dying the way Harvey did. He could
But
kill himself the way Trey kills himself. He could shoot himself. Endless amount of
The
ways.
question that does is if somebody goes and kills themselves in the sun, like the crew of Icarus One apparently did. Maybe they were compelled by Pinbacker. It's not really clear.
Yeah.
They have that spiritual experience, but they're not doing it out of necessity. That's just a suicide, right? It's just, I'm sitting in the sun. I have this experience. I'm gone. I'm not contributing to the mission. So you would say that, well, Searle's death is admirable because there's nothing he can do further to contribute to the mission. But if there was, his death would be selfish, right?
Well, no, because look at how they have Searle talk about the sun.
Yeah.
There's a very deliberate choice to have him die the way he wants to die, essentially.
Right.
Very few other characters get that choice.
But get that treatment. You're putting some sort of higher value on that kind of death. And I'm saying it only has meaning if it goes along with some self-sacrifice. So we admire Kaneda's death because he said, I am going to stay to do the practical thing of restoring the shield. And that means that I burn up in the sun. We admire Searle's death because he says, I'm going to do the practical thing of staying behind and getting abandoned because it needs to be done for the mission to be preserved. And then they have this death, this highly dignified death in the sun. I don't see, if they didn't have the self-sacrificing motive, that would be a selfish thing, and it would not be admirable. No matter what kind of spiritual transcendence, as you put it, they felt in the face of dying in the sun. We wouldn't value that death. And so you're saying, well, Mace's death is a little ugly, it's a little undignified, yet he dies in the same interest of self-sacrifice. It's hard for me to believe that death is inherently less value, or I don't.
Again, I'm talking about peace and contentment. You're talking about value. I think every character, with the exception of maybe Harvey, is sacrificing themselves in some way. I mean, Corazon sort of just gets stabbed from behind, but presumably she's working to protect the mission at that point, right? I mean, there's nothing shown that she's doing something selfish in the way Harvey was when she dies.
No.
So I think the vast majority of deaths are heroic. But
well, yeah, they're all heroic except for Harvey, who's a coward, and maybe there's something in that he dies from absolute zero. Movie might be saying something there for sure, because he became the least admirable character by far.
Yeah,
based on his behavior. But everyone else is constantly, especially Mace. I would say he's probably the most. Maybe you say Kappa because he's the one who understands how to release the bomb, but Mace is the most pivotal figure as far as the practical achievement of getting the mission done throughout the whole movie. So you can't say his death is meant to be shown in a lesser way or to be devalued by the movie in comparison to those that die in the light, because he was more crucial than anyone, and he died in the same instinct of self-sacrifice that they did.
Well, again, you keep jumping back on this value argument. They're all valued. The deaths are all of equal value, with the exception of Harvey. I would say, Mace may be actually even a little bit more. But I'm saying in terms of how the characters are experiencing their deaths, there is greater seemingly peace or virtue in not only the way that the film presents the deaths of the people who die in the light, but in the way the characters react to the deaths themselves.
We'd all like to die in a dignified way of acceptance. But if there's still something you can do,
and you don't think there's a deliberate choice, like, why is Mace not shown to be like accepting his death? The way they could have done it is he gets out of the water, but it's kind of too late, and he accepts it and just lays down and dies peacefully. They have his leg pinned, bleeding out. He's struggling until the very end.
because there's still something he can do. There's nothing Kaneda and Searle can do anymore. So the peaceful acceptance of death becomes admirable because there's nothing left for them to do.
Then Kaneda, arguably, there is. To me, there's some indication
try to
if
run.
he tries to get back, that, like, they were telling him, you got to get back now, you got to get back now, and he chose to stay there. He's like, this is my fate. I could try to run back. I don't think I'll make it, but I'll die trying. He said, no, this is my fate, and I'm at terms with that.
Well, if there's an implication that he could have saved himself, which I'm not sure there is, because it seemed pretty clear, I'm going to stay to fix the shield, and I understand that that's going to kill me. But if there was, then that actually shows some of the selfishness that's being portrayed in Pinbacker, doesn't it?
Well,
it's not in the interest of self-sacrifice, then. It's in the interest of, I seek the transcendent, in your words, experience of dying in the sun, even though I could have saved myself and continued to help the mission. That is a very negative.
Well, I think he knew he wasn't going to be able to save himself.
So then he knew it.
Right.
So he accepted his death because he realized there's nothing I can do. I've sacrificed for the mission, and I will die with dignity and in peace. But if there was a chance that he could have saved himself and he did that, it would not be admirable. That's essentially what the crew of Icarus I, whether they were coerced by Pinbacker or not, seemed to have done, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think that they're, he could have died struggling, and again, the film's presentation could have shown him burning up and lighting on fire and struggling till the very end. Like, I think the part that I'm putting a lot of emphasis on is how the film treats the deaths, whether it lingers on the pain of the death, as it does with Mace, with Harvey, with Cora. It lingers on the pain. She's bleeding out. He's pinned against a wall. He's freezing in space. And the camera's right in his face as we watch him freeze.
Yeah, and in his case, there might be an editorial condemnation of his cowardice. I grant that. But you cannot say that about the people who die in pain, desperately struggling to help save the mission. Ultimately, all you're doing is you're saying, I value the portrayal of a dignified death as opposed to a uglier, more undignified death of struggle to keep doing something while you're dying, as with Mace. You can't say that if the movie wants to. You can't say that the movie wants to put some sort of distance between them, because they're all ultimately focused on the sacrifice for the mission, whether it's ugly or dignified. It's still in the interest of self-sacrifice, which is the most important thing, which is the value that the movie, is primarily advocating.
Yeah. And I'm saying that that doesn't take away from its idea that science and faith can coexist. But I don't think one death is more heroic than the other. I think that there are characters that die in peace and there are characters who do not. And it's weird, and I don't think a coincidence, that the characters that seem to die in peace are the ones that die in by the sun. If you don't like the term in the light because you think there's some sort of greater, more virtuous connotation to that, die by the sun. To me, that there's a deliberate creative choice there to show those characters as the most content, not lingering on the pain, not showing them struggle in the end. They've resigned to their fate and they're content with it. And they just happen to die by the sun, and everyone else does not.
Yeah, but that's only admirable. That dignified pose is only admirable if you've exhausted your use for the mission. You've exhausted your ability to self-sacrifice for the mission. Mace has not. So if him dying that way, in some painful struggle, shows he is saying, as long as I am alive, I will try to help the mission. If you can't do that like Searle, then sure, go have a dignified death in the observation room, right? It's you're admiring the dignity of the death, but it needs to be, they have the caveat of there's nothing that they can do for the mission. So if Mace, facing that situation, said, I'm going to die, I'm going to go kill myself like Trey did or something, we would not admire that because he could still contribute to the mission.
Well, no, I think that there's certain characters that recognize, okay, I've done all I can do for the mission, and I'm cool with that. Those characters seem to be the people that die by the sun. Mace, is no less heroic. He might even be the most heroic character there. Yeah. I mean, Kappa is the last one. That doesn't necessarily make him the most heroic. Kappa can't do what he does if Mace doesn't do what he does. So Mace arguably is the most heroic death. But there doesn't seem to me to be a recognition in terms of the performance or the presentation in the scene that he's done all that he could. There doesn't seem to be that contentment and peace in the end. Like, there's no scene where they could have had it where his leg is pinned against the wall and Mace is like, this is it for me, Kappa. You're on your own. And then it shows him just quietly.
That's kind of what happens.
Well, he doesn't go quietly.
He doesn't go quietly, nor should he. If he did, we wouldn't. You are putting. I mean, if you're not, you keep saying I'm not putting a value judgment on it, and the movie's not. But you're basically saying that I admire a dignified pose in death, which you can only do when you've exhausted your capacities to self-sacrifice for the mission, when you've become useless to the purpose of the mission. You can only do that then. And so I don't see how you say you're not putting a value judgment on it, because you're saying
I'm putting a value on it, a judgment on it for the individual, not necessarily for the viewer to say this person was more heroic or virtuous than another. On the individual who's experiencing the death. That's what I'm putting the value on. I think there is greater. Kappa, Searle, and Kaneda feel greater value in terms of the experience of dying as a result in their belief that the sun was something greater in a transcendental sense. And in that way, their death is of greater value to them. With the other people, I feel like Mace is going to his death feeling like he could have done more, when what we're watching is suggesting that he couldn't. And that's not going to your death peacefully.
That's not fair. I mean, if your leg gets caught, you can struggle and there's nothing you can do. To just say that, yeah, he doesn't have a peaceful death because he really wants to make sure the mission survives. He hasn't exhausted. If he can get his leg out, he can still help. So why should he not struggle? There's nothing Searle can do. He can't go into space. I mean, he could. He'd die there. He chooses to die in the sun because there's nothing he can do. He's going to die, and there's nothing he can further contribute. You would not admire Mace if he surrendered to dying before struggling.
I don't think they would make the definitive aspect of Searle's character and psychology one of the sun means something greater I want to experience.
But, okay, you say that. What does the sun mean? What is the sun?
Well, again, I think it plays into the director's own comments on his own faith, which is a spiritual atheism, that there is an aesthetic, transcendental aesthetic experience to die by the sun, in a belief that there's a transcendental experience in that.
I get that.
And but he doesn't identify what it is. He's not saying it's God. He's not saying there's an afterlife. He's just saying that the experience is an out of body, somehow more even rewarding experience of death than not. And the people who die that death seem to be the ones that put a greater emphasis on what the sun is as an idea, as opposed to the others who are like, who view it more as, we're on a mission. This is what we got to do. We're just going to do what we got to do.
Well, then you would, if you take that to the logical end, which you have to do if you're saying that, then the Icarus One crew, we don't really know what their perspectives were on dying, but they basically said, we so badly want to, at least Pinbacker said this, we so badly want to have the, as you put it, the transcendental experience of the sun, that we will abort the mission to do that, basically.
Well,
Because we're saying the awesome power of nature is so overwhelming, and we want this experience, and the practical consideration of staying out of the sun so we can do the mission, it becomes subordinate to the so-called spiritual experience of taking in the sun and maybe thereby dying.
Well, I think what I'm suggesting is more of a Pascal's wager kind of idea. That it's worth, whether there's any reason for it, whether there's any experience you've had that proves it to you, it's worth believing in something greater. So when you die as a means of self-sacrifice, you are dying with a certain peace. And if you don't choose to have a deeper faith, then even though you're dying by the same self-sacrifice, there isn't a contentment or peace. There isn't this sensation that, okay, you may be moving on to something better or experiencing something higher in your death.
Did the Icarus One crew die in peace?
I don't know. That's not explored in the film.
Let's say they did. Does that make them admirable?
I mean, no, because what Pinbacker suggests is that the motivations were a shift in mindset from, we need to complete this mission absolutely to preserve humanity, to one of, we're not supposed to be doing this.
Right. That's the highest value in the movie, the fulfillment of the mission. You can indulge yourself in a so-called spiritual death in the sun when you have exhausted your capacity to be useful to the mission. You cannot do it if you haven't. And so to put that as some sort of value that the movie is promoting is not accurate, because it's almost saying the opposite, which is, if you get caught up in spiritual, considerations of the awesome power of the sun and like Pinbacker, you end up being a destructive force. You end up saying that awe given to nature supersedes the practical considerations of subduing nature to save mankind. So we admire Kaneda and Searle because they die in a dignified way when they are no longer capable of doing anything for the mission. That's the only reason. The highest value is the mission, though. And if you value the so-called transcendental experience of witnessing the sun or dying in the sun above the mission, that cannot be admirable. And so you seem to imply it's like a kind of a luxury for these guys to be able to die in the sun, and they have sort of a dignified, peaceful acceptance of it because it's an aesthetic experience, even though we would assume it ultimately becomes quite painful, even for the fraction of a second that you could feel anything, right?
Yeah.
If you have that value, it's subordinate to the value of preserving yourself to help the mission. And if you put it above that, then you have become, quite evil, as Pinbacker has, which is I revere the power of the sun, and we have no right to meddle with the natural processes that it's part of. You can only indulge the spiritual side of things when you have given your all and you're no longer useful to the practical side of things.
Yeah, I just think that again, it's about you're trying to tie the self-sacrifice to a faith, whereas I'm saying that they're two separate things, that the self-sacrifice is something they all give. Some have a deeper faith in some higher power that makes that self-sacrifice a more peaceful, contented thing, versus others who don't have that, which makes it doesn't make it take away from the value of the self-sacrifice. It doesn't even take away from the recognition that they are self-sacrificing. What it takes away from is perhaps a contentment with their death, that either in their death that they're experiencing as it's happening, there's a peace with it, as opposed to a pain.
Space is death. It's we have to go there to save life on Earth because Earth is in space. But it's a more negative thing. And the earthbound mace is the most practical of all the crew members in fulfilling the mission. And so the indulgence in some spiritual understanding of the sun and dying in the sun is, it can only be admirable as long as you're putting the interests of the earth, the interests of human life above it. And and if you get to the point of Pinbacker, where you have put the so-called spiritual transcendent aspect of the viewing the sun above the considerations of the earth, you have very clearly crossed into a state of evil.
Yeah, up for interpretation, the spiritual versus the science in Sunshine, a complex movie that deals with a lot of these themes. Definitely one that's worth checking out. But so that's our conversation on the 2007 film Sunshine. Let us know if you agree with the points being made or disagree, whatever the case may be. Let us know in the comments. And next week we're going to be talking about the Coen brothers film Inside Llewyn Davis. So catch that next week on Dueling Banjos.